In the Freestyle Chess GOAT challenge, Magnus Carlsen fought back to defeat Alireza Firouzja in their quarterfinal match. And I've been looking at their first tiebreak game. This endgame is absolutely fascinating, so I'd like to drill down deep into this. So we joined the game after 64 moves. No, I'm not going to show you the whole game. So 64 moves, it's complex enough. So Carlsen with black, I pawn up, but all the pieces are on the king side. And it should be a draw, but it still gets tricky. If this knight is separated from the king and pawn, then that's dangerous. Then there's potential to win the knight. And that knight needs an anchor. But Firouzja found a really clever drawing idea. He played his knight back to h3. If that's taken, then this is theoretical draw. The king just needs to step back into the corner, and the bishop is the wrong colour. You need a light squared bishop for that pawn to win. Of course, black can win this pawn very easily, but there is no way to force the king out of the corner, and that's a theoretical draw. So, clever drawing idea to keep the knight close to the king and pawn. And now it's very hard to see how black can actually break this idea. So Firouzja also, of course, both players were playing against the clock as well. So it makes it easy if you know your next few moves. You can just shuffle back and forth with the knight, so you gain time as well. They got 10 seconds increment for each move. So clearly this defensive idea threw Carlsen a little bit, because it's very hard to see how you can make progress now. And in fact, he blundered with king d4. He's trying to regroup, but this is incorrect, because white can actually simply jump round and take the pawn h5, and that's just a draw. But Firouzja was obviously very pleased to be able to play some moves quickly and stuck with his defensive idea of knight h3. Fair enough, because it's very hard to see how black is going to make any progress. But watch how Carlsen regrouped. It's very clever. Knight f2. Knight h3. Looks like Carlsen's just going backwards. Now watch what he does with the bishop. Bishop b6. The knight came to h3, and now bishop e3. So you can see the bishop restricts the knight. Does it matter? Well, actually not at the moment, because after knight f2, in fact, if this is taken, then it's just a theoretical draw. Let's just have a quick look at that. Carlsen actually played king e5 here. But if bishop takes knight, this is just a draw. After this, there's no way through. And if h4, then the king gets back in time. And if king c4, then the king steps up. So that one is just a draw. So Carlsen played king e5. Now this is interesting. This is the problem now for Firouzja. If he plays knight h3, in fact, he can't stick to this. He didn't play this, but this actually loses now after king e4. So one thing is the knight can't go back, because after the exchange, then king d3, the king will be forced back and black wins the pawn. And here, so the king, the knight can't move because of the bishop. And when the king steps back, say king h1, the king moves in, black king moves in. And this is now lost. Watch what happens. There's a very clever idea. So black still can't take here. That would still be a draw. Actually, even that's, let me see. Still, that's even tricky because you can stalemate the king. Anyway, no, I think it still is a draw actually. But here is the way to do it. H4. This is an incredible winning idea. And then G3. And white is in Zugzwang. There's no way to survive this. So, for example, knight here, here, and you win the knight. Beautiful. So the point is this. Firouzja can't continue with his defensive idea of knight h3. So knight d3 check, king e4. Now this is really dangerous because the knight is now separating from the king and pawn. Now my computer tells me that knight b2 is still drawn for white, but that's not obvious. Firouzja played knight b4. What's the difference? Well, now it's lost because after this move, the knight is in trouble. So here's what happened. Knight c6, king d5. Can it escape? No. Watch what happens. Knight here and bishop b4. You see that knight is really restricted now. Knight b8. Bishop c3. Now this is a really interesting moment in the game actually. So there's a kind of Zugzwang. I mean, let's look at the possible moves. Now, Firouzja played king f2 here. But let's see what happens on knight b7. So king here. And knight b7 and bishop b4. Got it. Knight is trapped. King c7 wins the next turn. So knight f7. Bishop f6 controls these squares. Okay, white can do nothing. And the king just slides over. And the knight is trapped. Okay, what else? What about king h2? Then the knight can be pushed like this. This is very clever actually. Bishop e5, threatening h4. And then you trap the knight like that. And the king just marches in. Firouzja played king f2. And that's a very unfortunate square for the king. Bishop f6 hits the knight. And bishop d4 checks. So here is where Firouzja resigned, because if king e2, bishop b6, well, you can see the knight, all these squares are now covered. And so the king just steps back to win the knight. And white's king, I'm afraid this just doesn't work after this. Can't get through to the pawns because h4, of course, and the g pawn will go through, and so on. Absolutely brilliant technique from Magnus Carlsen. And I think what was really impressive was that even though knight h3 just looks as though white is going to draw very easily, he still managed to compose himself and present more problems. And eventually Firouzja was the one that cracked. Reminds me very much of a game that Carlsen played in the World Rapid against Mahsoud Lou. I'll show you that on another occasion. Thanks for watching.